Hello and welcome to the Colts Cover-2 Podcast. I'm Joel A. Erickson. I'm joined, as always, by Nate Atkins. We are both down a little bit, Nate because he's been sick all week, and me because we are recording this just after the news broke that the legendary Milwaukee Brewers broadcaster Bob Uecker passed. I think I've mentioned on here I'm a Brewers fan before. Uecker kind of is baseball to us, so it's a tough one to go with. It's one of those things that kind of reminds me of like what it means to be a fan and everything like that, and be the people, in terms of what you guys listening are thinking with the Colts, because the day of Ballard's presser, I was listening to a Milwaukee Brewers offseason podcast in the gym before I went over there to do the interview. So just throwing that out there, let you guys know, Nate and I both understand what it means to be a fan. Nate will live and die with the Cleveland Cavaliers. So just because we cover the Colts and have to be very
harsh week to bring that up to the Indiana crowd, but yes, that's true.
If they want to if they want to have, you guys can have your own little tete-a-tete if you want to about the Cavs and the Pacers.
It's actually they split with the Cavs this past week, and
I was going to say, didn't they split?
That's actually much more impressive. They did.
Your team only has 5 losses. Your team only has 5 losses this year. Anybody who's beaten you should feel pretty good about it.
I know, and that one was in Cleveland, so actually, Pacers more than passed the test. But yeah,
how angry was Nate Atkins when the Pacers beat the Cavs? He doesn't even have to answer, guys. You heard it. You heard that laugh.
Can't win them all. Don't think they'll get the record for wins, but
that's masking deep-seated anger.
That's coping for sure.
The Colts, we are in is normally a little bit of the doldrums for the Colts. They're in the off season. They're kind of in the evaluation period. Every team goes through that. That's not like anything special, or this is what every team does after their season's over. Even the Super Bowl team, they just have to do it a little faster. Every team goes through these big, long evaluation periods where they kind of set their off season. But this one for the Colts is obviously, and this is where we're going to spend most of our time today. This one for the Colts is dominated by the fact that they need a new defensive coordinator. Gus Bradley is gone, and we've reported 5 interviews for the job so far. Those 5 are former Saints coordinator and head coach Dennis Allen, longtime NFL coach Steve Wilkes, Bengals coach Lou Anarumo, Michigan defensive coordinator, and also former Ravens and Giants defensive coordinator Wink Martindale, and Browns safeties coach Ephraim Banda. There's one thing that sticks out to me about all these 5 that ties them all together, but I'm going to let Nate give you his thoughts first.
Yeah, it's a different flavor than what we're used to. Since ever since Chris Ballard got here, it's only been 2 defensive coordinators, Matt Eberflus and then Gus Bradley. I got to cover the very end of the Eberflus time for half a season, and then obviously 3 years with Gus. And the complaint that a lot of fans have had, watching especially the Bradley version of this, is sort of it's a passive scheme. It's not super aggressive. That's the design. It's like these guys aren't putting the same amount of hours into this that all these other candidates do. It's just sort of like where's your philosophy line? And for Chris Ballard, he's always been very involved with the defensive side, hiring both of those. I mean, he hired Matt Eberflus and basically passed him on to Frank Reich after Josh McDaniels backed out, and then somewhat similar with Gus Bradley and Shane Steichen, though they knew each other. Chris has driven that conversation because he used to coach cornerbacks. That's just the side of the ball that he seems more comfortable with owning from a draft and stock the roster and build philosophy point of view. And so I think coverages have long dictated where Chris Ballard has liked to lean with that, which that tends to be more zone, which just tends to be a little bit more passive with kind of the 4-man front zone approach he has. And it's, Eberflus and Bradley had two different versions of that. Bradley with more your kind of hulking press cornerbacks feeding into a single high safety the way Seattle did, and Matt Eberflus was more of your Tampa 2 type of style, going back to Lovie Smith, which is what Chris Ballard built out with the Bears that got them to a Super Bowl that kind of formulated this approach for him. So, but they similar idea though of not heavy blitzers. They kind of make you a higher completion percentage. It tends to be what you give up, but you hope that you're stingy in the red zone and you really stop the run, and that can get your pass rush going in obvious passing down situations. And it worked at times with Matt Eberflus. They had top 10 defenses, even though they gave up a lot of yards, top 10 in points, I think, every year that he was here. And they would get turnovers too, tend to be top 10 in turnovers. With Gus Bradley, it obviously tapered off. I thought they had a nice year in 2022, and then it's just kind of fallen off for reasons that he's had to own, but also Chris Ballard's having to own. So I think this is I'd kind of gotten a tip from somebody in the know heading into this search before they'd schedule the interviews that they were looking at a kind of a larger shift than just let's get someone different to call a similar system. It wasn't about the voice, the messaging, the leadership of Gus Bradley. They loved Gus as a person, and that's what Shane really brought through toward the end, and that's kind of why they stuck together and were a fit. But they wanted a different. They want to look more open-mindedly to a different style, a different way to handle what is now just such a monstrous field of AFC quarterbacks, and finding ways to combat them, to make life difficult on them. Whereas they've run a system here for the past few years that, while there's some strengths to it, the negative is kind of make life easy on veteran quarterbacks. And so I think the guys they're bringing in now show you that they're very open-minded to being aggressive. Maybe they'll add someone else to this list that, that maybe who knows what their ultimate choice will be. But the 5 guys you mentioned, I think you'd have to say all of them are a good step more aggressive than either Matt Eberflus or Gus Bradley. Some of them have similar approaches. I don't think they're going away from the 4-man approach, 4-man front, but coverage-wise and blitzing and how you deploy your safeties, I think this is showing that they're open-minded to a significant shift in really that aggressiveness level.
Well, and really, like, you hate to boil it down like this because defenses are more than this, but the easiest thing I think for fans to grasp is just blitzing. Gus Bradley and Matt Eberflus both ran defenses that were among the league's lowest in terms of blitzing percentage year after year after year. I think I've said on this pod that I kind of prefer the blitz, but the NFL's gone away from it. Like, the guys that they're talking about now are all known for pressure in one way or the other. The guys they're all talking to. Wade Martindale is. Do you remember the Titans scene where he gets mad at the ref for trying to fix the game and tells him to do it right, and then he tells his defense, "You blitz all night. I don't want them to gain another yard." That's basically Wink Martindale's defensive philosophy.
Yeah.
He runs blitz percentages that are like close. I think one of the ones I saw was like 44.5%, which is insane. That's so much higher than most teams in the NFL. But these other guys, Steve Wilks, like a lot of the stuff you're going to read on Steve Wilks if you poke around on him, is going to say low blitzing, but that's because he had to run the 49ers defense with the 49ers. They hired him and said, you have to run this defense that we already have. Prior to that, he was a heavy blitz guy. Lou Anarumo is kind of like a kitchen sink defensive coordinator. Like, whatever he thinks is going to work and whatever these guys can run, he's going to find a way to do it. Dennis Allen, oddly enough, is like the least aggressive of these guys. But the thing I remember most from covering Dennis Allen is that when teams were in 2-minute drills and going down to the end, the biggest thing with him was you always knew an all-out blitz was coming. You just didn't know when. And then Ephraim Banda, we don't know a ton about him because he's only been in the NFL for 2 years. But his history is with Manny Diaz and Jim Schwartz. And if you know anything about those two, I'm gonna guess he's gonna blitz and put pressure on the quarterback and stuff like that. The biggest thing to me is just if you think about Shane Steichen and what the Colts have struggled with blitzes the last 2 years. They have. Regardless of who's at quarterback, which I think is interesting. Like it's not just a Richardson thing. They struggled when Flacco was at quarterback. They struggled with blitzing, and I've always wondered if, as an offensive coach, if the right thing to do when you're looking for a defensive coordinator is not to it's just to go, who gives me trouble? Who do I have trouble figuring out? And like Shane Steichen has trouble figuring out the blitz.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I know late in the season, Shane Steichen took more of a look at the defense, more of a hands-on approach, or not so much hands-on approach, but like an overview of that entire group to figure out what was going on, why were they lagging. And so I think that's, he comes at it from a different lens because he's not, he's been so insularly focused on play design and play calling on the offensive side. He doesn't have as much defensive background, but that's where he can go at it is, hey, what gives us problems? What's been giving us problems? And the blitz has been such an issue for them this year. And then you notice that midseason, I'd say around midseason, the Colts they started blitzing more, and it didn't really work a lot. I think for a couple different reasons. Number one, it's just not natural to the way their defensive system is built, the way that their defensive coaches coach. It just isn't like they were trying something new, but sort of in the middle of a season. Whereas that, if you're going to do that, that needs to be a little bit more of an off-season install. So it felt like the Colts blitzes never really. They either were easy for offenses to identify pre-snap, or they came situationally when they were just expecting it. They didn't seem to get the free rushers that opponents would get on them. Again, part of that was, I think it was less natural for the scheme, and maybe when Gus Bradley was willing to and comfortable to dial it up. Also, I don't know that the skill sets that they used for blitzers were the best. I don't think that's Zaire Franklin's game. He is not really like a downhill, guy's going to just win with speed and get after the quarterback so much. He's more your classic middle linebacker. EJ Speed, I thought, would be better at that because I feel like there's been moments before this past season where he's kind of surprised with some pressure. But that mix of trying to time it up, disguise it, and execute it, it didn't work out super well for him either. The guys that I thought were better suited to blitz on this team would be Kenny Moore and Nick Cross. I thought maybe they could have done more with that, and they probably could have, but part of it is, Kenny Moore by the end with Julian Blackmon hurt was one of the only reliable coverage guys they had out there to keep this glued together. So it's almost like they would sacrifice the basis of their defensive system to blitz the one guy that's holding together the coverage that's supposed to kind of be the strength of this thing. So I just think it's that's going to be part of this approach. Is it's an interesting thing to do to switch up the defensive philosophy with this current roster because Chris Ballard admitted that running it back was not the right decision. Signed too many guys, didn't have enough competition. So that would lead you to believe that there's going to be some tweaks or open spots on the defense, but I wonder how much they're willing to change with that. Because I don't know that, like, it's going to have to come from both ends. If they're going to become a blitzing team, they have to have blitzing personnel or have the freedom to blitz the right guys. I can just see a world where, like, if Wink Martindale comes in here and is blitzing Kenny Moore all the time, and then the secondary is what we saw at the end of the year. I mean, that's what got Wink Martindale out of the NFL in the first place and sent back to college for a little bit, is he did a little too much cover zero blitzes. It got to be, once offenses could read it just a little bit, it was such a risky thing to do, an all or nothing approach. And so they got to have the right personnel. Like, there's times when it's worked really well for Wink with the Ravens when they had those lockdown outside man cover corners, and then with the Giants it kind of fell apart when that was less their strength. So that does seem to be where they're trending, is someone that's going to blitz more. All these guys do it significantly more than the last two coordinators, but I'm just interested to see kind of how that trickles into how they build the entire defense. We're not going to know that till we get into free agency and whatnot. But that would be the way for Chris Ballard to follow through on both. We're going to get more aggressive on defense, but also we are not just going to run it back and be comfortable here. And some of that can be, moving on from certain guys, or at least bringing in competition that does bring in skill sets that are better to blitz than what they've had so far, specifically at linebacker. I think that's the spot where that's got to change a little bit.
Yeah. The other piece of like linebacker, for instance, Zach Hicks and I were talking this. I made an appearance on his podcast. Love the work Zach does. We were talking a little bit about like Dennis Allen. You bring up the linebacker piece. So if Colts fans don't know a lot about him because the Saints haven't been good for a little bit, the Saints have had one of the best off-ball linebackers in football for the better part of the last decade. His name is Mario Davis. Davis's sack totals with Dennis Allen as coordinator: 5, 4, 4, 3, 6.5, 6.5, and then it dropped to 2 this year. But Allen was gone halfway through the year. Like, to your point about sacks and what you're talking about there, like the guy, I wonder if this is like one of those things that kind of comes back a little bit like the quarterback that we are supposed to not talk about, but like. The guy that was a great blitzer as a linebacker was Leonard. Leonard was incredible at it. He was really good at timing it up. I think that's one of the things with EJ Speed, I think that maybe sticks out to me is that like there's an element of blitzing and pressure and all that stuff that is very instinctual, and you have to make the right decision in the right moment. And just for lack of a better way of putting it, EJ Speed struggled with that. He struggled with the in the moment decision making and stuff this year. So I think that's part of it. The other thing I want to get to, though, and this is a little bit more in depth, it's a little bit harder for fans to see, is that the other thing about a lot of these guys is they're really good about disguising their coverages. In other words, they show you one thing. And then something else happens after the snap. Anarumo got famous for this because of those Bengals runs through the playoffs. Wilkes is a secondary guy. Dennis Allen's a secondary guy by trade. They know how to do this very well. Martindale just assumes that you'll be dead and you don't need to worry about it. That's probably oversimplifying it. I just like making jokes about how much weight Martindale blitzes because it's a ton. And then Banda, like I said, we don't know a lot about him, but the places he comes from sort of fit that. Here's the thing about defense in the NFL. I'll try to make this fairly simple for those of you who aren't. Defense and offense, like play calling in the NFL and game planning is pretty much not all, but a lot of it is about what look is the defense giving us? What's the right thing to run against what coverage they're running, what coverage they're going to be running. And then if they're not running that, what can we check to, what play can we run that will be able to attack that? Like there's stuff that's better against man. There's stuff that's better against cover 2. There's stuff that's better against cover 3. And if you run those things against if you run those things against the wrong coverage, it's a much harder read and there's not going to be as much open. So a lot of the chess match between an offensive play caller and a defensive play caller is trying to figure out what coverage, what look they're going to be in, and making the play call for that. And I know Shane Steichen, I know from talking to him just over the course of 2 years, Shane Steichen is big into that game. I think every NFL coordinator is. I think that's pretty much like why they spend as much time as they do during the week preparing is because they're looking for that stuff. I think they're looking for a guy who's harder to read. Because Gus Bradley's system, and he would tell you this himself, in fact, that he did say it this year after the running game issues the first 2 weeks, his bent is to go simpler, more simple every time and let the players play fast. But the thing about simple is simple can be easy to read. And easy to figure out from a play calling standpoint. it sounds like Steichen wants the guys that he's in a chess match more with, based on the guys that are in this search so far.
Yeah, I think in the way it goes back to where we started this, where Shane Steichen last year, what was so impressive was it felt like anytime teams wanted to run man coverage against him, he would just find ways to dice them up, whether it was pre-snap motion, a lot of man beater concepts, RPO game. They just found their success that way. This year, it didn't work out nearly the same way because those blitzes messed it up so much. They didn't get into their bag because the blitzes took them out of it. And so that's sort of the idea, is that like if you're going, it's one thing to be able to read the coverage that you're going to get, and then it's another to be able to read the blitz. So you're kind of some of these guys, when they get at their best, are going to challenge you on both of those levels, and that's pretty hard for a lot of quarterbacks and offenses. It's hard, obviously, for young quarterbacks, but also young centers. That I think that's a big reason why the Colts face that with the guys that they had back there this year, or just moving pieces too. So yeah, that's a part of it. It's the other thing too. We talk about personnel is that if you're going to blitz, you're going to lighten just your overall coverage structure. That's where usually you want to have really good outside corners that can play man coverage. I mentioned that for Wink Martindale when he was in Baltimore. He had Marlon Humphrey and Marcus Peters was when it was working, and then it fell off kind of with Marcus Peters getting older, and then when he went to New York, didn't have the same. They tried to sign Adoree Jackson, and it just didn't come together quite the same way. Similar thing is with Ephraim Banda in the Browns, even though he's not the one calling that. The defense they run, though, it worked so well last year because they had Denzel Ward on one side and a couple different guys. The other spots that were Pro Bowl levels, Martin Emerson and Greg Newsome in the slot. So that's like they were able to become the number one defense when they were able to blitz but also have that cover, that sticky man outside coverage. That's not the only way to do it. I mean, like Steve Wilkes, I think he tends to be more of like your zone type of. He calls a lot more zone than those other guys that I mentioned. So there are different ways to do it, but it's tricky. It's like it's just one of those areas where like you look at the outside corners on this team, and it's just, that could be a spot where maybe we see some of those changes I mentioned because initially they draft Juju Brents because he is your archetype of the Gus Bradley hulking outside cornerback and press, and Jalen Jones kind of a similar thing. And well, going into this year though, who knows on Juju Brents? I don't think you can count on it when he's just played like 11 career games and only parts of those. And then Jalen Jones, fine player, like he could be in the mix, but it's not someone that certainly it feels like there's a door open at both of those spots, and there's not really anything under contract behind them. So who knows? Maybe that's an area where if they want to get aggressive in free agency, or maybe early, at least by the second round of the draft, go for maybe a different type of cornerback. Maybe they go a little bit more toward when Matt Eberflus was here, that was less the size at outside cornerback, and it was a little bit more the you had a mix of things. Isaiah Rodgers had the recovery speed, and then some other guys had more of the ball skills. But that's where like it's just that's the big risk, is if you're going to blitz. And why a lot of coaches don't do it is like the risk of explosive play is so high. You either need those corners who have that man coverage ability and recovery speed, or obviously really good safeties. This team, I don't know that you look at any of those four spots outside of the nickel and say they're really set there. So that's like where it's got to come together if they're going to run this. They're going to have to. We could see a lot of player movement, or should see a lot of player movement, especially on the back end.
Well, that's the thing with a lot of these guys is Anarumo. Most Bengals fans and most Bengals like observers that I've been around feel like Anarumo didn't get dumber; they just got worse in terms of talent. Like they got to the point where it's basically just Trey Hendrickson as a difference maker. Like they lost Jesse Bates, that was a big deal. He kind of erased everything back there for Anarumo. Martindale, if you look at Martindale's defenses, the first 3 years with Baltimore, he was incredible. And then the numbers started to go the other way. Like he still had some success from like a point standpoint or a big game standpoint with the Ravens and Giants. but his yardage numbers were bad towards the end, and that's because of what you're saying. Like, they didn't have the talent base around them. Allen is a little bit different in that he navigated a corner shift with the Saints pretty well, but there's a huge caveat to that. And the huge caveat is that regardless of what you watched in the playoffs last week, Marshawn Lattimore for years has been incredible. And that's the kind of weapon that he could deploy on. Like, the reason that game was such a big deal is that for years Lattimore has shut down Mike Evans in matchups between them. So he had that piece to go with it. So yeah, that's probably the case with any scheme, even if they're running the Gus Bradley scheme, is because we saw it last year. They gave up explosive plays. They have to get better in those spots. But you're right. It's going to put, if you're going to blitz, if you're going to bring more pressure, if you're going to have Kenny Moore coming off the edge and doing all that stuff, you've got to have guys that can cover. But clearly they felt like, the Colts feel like this is where you started the pod. Clearly the Colts feel like they've got to do something to give the defensive line a chance, because the story of the last 2 years has been, they feel like they have a good defensive line. We can go back and forth about how well the defensive line played this year, but like for the intents and purposes of what the Colts have told us and what they might do going forward, Chris Ballard believes the defensive line was better than I do, basically. So based on that, they clearly feel like if they don't have answers there, it doesn't matter, because teams just throw quick, they block 6 or 7. But all of this is predicated on you have to have better corners and better safeties. You just do. And honestly, better linebackers.
Oh, yeah. I think the entire back end, based on what Chris Ballard said, and again, the test will be how much he follows through when he sees prices and he has to actually make decisions on moving away from people. But based on what he laid out last week was he really likes that defensive front, but I don't know that he said anything positive about the guys outside the defensive front. I mean, we know he likes Kenny Moore, so that we don't have to draw conclusions there, but everything else should be somewhat on the table, at least in terms of like playing time. I'm not saying they're going to overturn all these guys on the roster, but that should be open there, because for the second straight year, Chris has talked about, like, when teams want to go 6-man protections and max protect or throw quick, they just negated that defensive line. It's the highest paid defensive line in the NFL. And yet in last year, it was a top 5 unit in sacks, but the pressures were a lot lower. So it's sort of an inconsistent sort of thing. This year, both of those numbers were probably more middle of the pack, or, lower, I think, on some levels with the, things like pass rush win rate. That's, again, like I'm with you. I don't think the defensive line played as well this year as it did last year. I just didn't feel like any guy other than DeForest Buckner you could feel like was really a difference maker, that it was just about coverage. But there is an argument to be made that, like, they ran into the worst of this, where they have a scheme that's going to give up some completions. It's a zone-based scheme. It's like that, but it's also, they also didn't tackle underneath. And so that's where it felt like when this team would have a team in 3rd and 15, you had no idea whether they were going to get the stop or not, even though their defense should be theoretically built to stop that. And so if that's where you're at, if you're kind of a bend but don't break defense, but you don't feel good about even getting off the field in 3rd and 12, then that's where you do have to start entertaining, like, switching something up. And I think when he talks about, like, he's trying to find a way to maximize the investments that they keep pouring into that defensive line, because those guys are not really going anywhere. Dio Dangba's a free agent, and so maybe he moves on, but we'll see what they do with Samson Ebicom, who's coming off the Achilles tear. But even still, they've got they picked up Kwity Paye's option. They just spent the 15th overall pick on Latu. They've invested those guys in the interior. They got to find a way to make them matter more. And so I think you look at, like, a team like the Browns, when they're built up front too, obviously with Myles Garrett, but that's where they complemented that with an aggressive, some blitzing, but also that aggressive man coverage approach on the outside, because they had the cornerbacks to do it. That made it so you can't just, we're just going to max protect and get away from Myles Garrett. I mean, he became a defensive player of the year last year because teams couldn't get away from him. And the Colts don't have a Myles Garrett, obviously, but they have guys that they feel like should be impacting, should be higher sack, higher pressure guys. None of that really came together this year, and it seems like they're looking at both the defensive structure and the coverage players as the reason why.
I'm not convinced that Latu doesn't take a step. That often happens with pass rushers. I'm not saying necessarily that what I'm trying to say is what I'm about to say has less to do with what I think about Latu as a pick, but it has more to do with what's happened since then and what the Colts didn't have. The Eagles ended up with both of the corners that a lot of people projected to the Colts last offseason. And I don't remember what everyone's draft evaluation was of Quinion Mitchell and Cooper DeJean. I know DeJean gave people some conniption fits a little bit. Both of those guys were really good.
Mm-hmm.
I was just reading somebody put together an all-rookie team for ESPN. Both of those guys made it. DeJean maybe is not a perfect fit because it sounds like the thing he's done is be able to play slot in Fangio's scheme, which is normally the type of thing that basically only a veteran should be able to do. So with Kenny Moore there, maybe not. But Quinion Mitchell, that's an outside corner that they could have drafted in that spot. Or what pick did Cooper DeJean go at? Because he dropped a little bit, right?
Yeah. I think the second round was he? Yep, 40th overall.
40th overall. Would you rather have A.D. Mitchell or Cooper DeJean at this point?
Well, based on 1 year, it would have to be Cooper.
And that's not to say
those guys aren't even the best corners that the Eagles have. That's Darius Slay. So yeah.
They drafted these these guys that the Colts were talking about, that the people talked about the Colts drafting an obvious need at the position. The Colts passed on him. Now, if you say you want to take Latu, the Colts clearly, believe he's the best rusher in the draft. We'll see as his career goes on if he can live up to that. But that second round pick, just given the need there, and maybe Alec Pierce doesn't turn into Alec Pierce. I think the Colts feel like the competition helped. Maybe you can get somebody in the third round who does the same thing. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is get somebody. You could have gotten somebody in the draft who upgraded one of these positions and didn't do it at all. And that's a big deal, especially I'm reading through real quick, reading through once again, this all rookie team. They've got 3 corners on it: Lassiter from Houston, Mitchell, and then Cooper DeJean. But then the honorable mentions, a lot of the stuff in the honorable mentions is there's a lot of good options at corner, guys who played really well. Colts didn't take any of them in that draft, and it ended up hurting them.
That's interesting decision to look back on. It was interesting at the time because I remember asking Chris Ballard right after that Mitchell pick, the AD Mitchell pick. It felt like there was that big run on corners right around where Cooper DeJean went. And so it was right before the Colts picked. I asked him if he considered trading up, and it sounded like it wasn't an option to them at all. I don't know if that meant they didn't like those players, or what I do think was a factor was Reggie Wayne and Shane Steichen were really pounding the table for A.D. Mitchell at that point.
And they really wanted a wide receiver. They did really, really want a wide receiver.
They did. I mean, we know they were trying to trade up with the Giants from Hard Knocks, which it's certainly at least a pass catcher, if not a wide receiver. So this is one of the issues, though, that they've run into with the draft has to bring every newcomer. They had more positions they needed to go and find answers to than what was actually going to be there for them. It's like they didn't really like the cornerbacks in the free agent class, and that it certainly wasn't a great crop, but they ended up not getting any new corners because they didn't like the ones in free agency. And then they saw Eddie Mitchell there, and they thought he would drop to them, so they didn't trade up to get one of these other corners. And then they got caught in no man's land because Eddie Mitchell wasn't ready to go. And then the corners that they had, you could say, Jalen Jones, and then they fell into Samuel Womack, which is also, good find for them, but they needed him to be released to get him. Those guys were all right this year, but the upside was never going to be what Quinion Mitchell or Cooper DeJean could bring. They just are. There's a reason Samuel Womack was a waiver claim. There's a reason Jalen Jones got the 7th round. They don't have that high-end athleticism. And I think that was one of the flaws that Ballard's run into over the years. If you look at him, he just is not drafted very well at corner. And part of it is that he hasn't taken a lot of upper level moves. He's never done a first round corner.
3 second rounders.
3 second rounders. And those they haven't totally worked out. And who knows, Juju may just be an injury thing that's unfortunate. But I do think part of it is he came up as a cornerbacks coach, and the system that he prefers is this more zone-based system. I think there's this belief that it's more about the system. You can coach guys to it and develop them. There's probably truth to that, but it also part of what you do, from a coordinator's point of view, part of what you do with those corners depends on how good they are. So the Eagles are a good example of this because I covered Vic Fangio when he was in Chicago. And the Fangio system is that's kind of very different than the ones they're going after, but that's that too high shell place that a lot of defenses have gone. But that tends to be a heavier zone scheme by nature, but they're running a lot of man. You know why? Because they have Darius Slay and they have Quinion Mitchell and they have Cooper DeJean. And you saw Darius Slay in the last playoff game for the Eagles got a pick in man coverage because I covered him in Detroit. He's one of the rare players who can get interceptions in man coverage. So he kind of evolves the scheme that way. And so it's I thought they just limited themselves too much with the archetypes they were going for, to where they need to squeeze the absolute most out of a Samuel Womack or a Jalen Jones. And maybe there was a little bit more to squeeze, maybe not, but there's still a limitation in terms of you weren't going to have Jalen Jones cover a guy in man coverage across the field. That's just, he's not built that way. Whereas some of these other guys like a Quinion Mitchell, that would have helped more with that. So I think they've just boxed themselves in a little bit too much at cornerback types with either just, guys who can hawk and zone with Matt Eberflus or these big physical press guys, because that's what Gus Bradley had. There's something between those extremes, and the higher you go in the draft, the more likely you're going to get a guy who can play a few different ways at outside corner.
Yeah, this ESPN piece, because one of the things that happens to you and me is that we spend so much time thinking about the Colts. It's hard for us to really pay a ton of attention to other teams' rookies to know. And so this honestly, there were so many good options here after listing 6 guys. Just the fact that they didn't take one, I think it is really damning, because do you know the name Tarheeb Still?
No.
Tarheeb Still was a 5th round draft pick by the Chargers this offseason. Out of Maryland. I think Maryland.
I couldn't tell you.
He started 12 games for the Chargers, had 4 picks. His, according to Pro Football Reference, quarterback rating against was 82.3, 64% completion. These aren't incredible numbers, but you know who they're better than? All of the Colts outside corners.
Yeah. Well, and another example of a guy
that's a guy that we were talking about first and second rounders. That's a guy that got picked in the 5th round, just in front of Anthony Gould. We're talking about, he's still available well of it into the draft. I'm sure the ESPN article mentions that there's others. I'm sure there's other guys who would fall into that category of they could have had them. Jalen Jones was around Tarheeb Still in terms of quarterback rating. completion percentage, that kind of thing. Gave him few more yards per target. Didn't have the interceptions. But Sam Womack, for as much as he was a surprise, by the end of the season, some of those touchdowns he gave up, that stuff his rate numbers went up.
Yeah, and another guy that you'll see this weekend that's balling out as a rookie, Mike Sanderstill of the Commanders. He was a second-round pick out of Michigan and 2 picks above A.D. Mitchell, so I guess it would have taken a slight trade up. But, he's out there and he started 16 games. And what's interesting is, again, like Dan Quinn runs that defense. So, like the idea at the time of Sanderstill was less of a fit for that outside corner spot because of the way that they built it. Yeah, he's shorter. He's 5'10". They ended up relying on Sam Womack, though, who's basically the same size.
And also, I know you know this, but what position did Mike Sanderstill play this year for Washington? He played outside.
Outside corner, yeah. And what's interesting is, at outside, the system he played in at Michigan is the one that Wink Martindale runs. They just keep rotating those guys who were like Ravens coordinators, go back there and teach that. So it's like now they're going to be more open-minded guys like this. But that, I think, is the box that they, like we said, they put themselves in, is they had like one type for corner. And so then it's very easy to say we don't like the guys in free agency and we don't want to go too high for one in the draft because we definitely got to get a pass rusher since we didn't get that in free agency. We got to get a wide receiver since we don't have number 4. It just underscores kind of the mix of things where they have a very certain scheme that they want to run, but also they aren't leaving themselves open by filling needs in free agency to be able to pounce on these guys. And they need to start doing that. Especially if they want to overhaul this defense, there's going to be guys in the draft that fit it. And as we're seeing with those cornerbacks we just mentioned, they can step in and play pretty well as rookies, but you got to be willing to go out and get them when they're available in the second round.
Yeah. The funny thing is this has kind of ended up becoming as we talk about the defensive coordinators, it's ended up becoming a referendum on their secondary in general, but I would say that we probably have good reason for that. And to cite someone, I would just cite, Chris Ballard himself. What's your evaluation of the secondary? We've got to be better at both cornerback and safety. We've got to be better. That's all he said.
Yeah.
He didn't do the thing he normally does where he's like, well, this guy really surprised and you guys aren't giving him enough credit, or the thing he did with the defensive line where he was like, I actually think they didn't play bad. Like, I know the sack numbers weren't there. He didn't say any of that stuff. There were no qualifiers, nothing whatsoever. All he said is about both positions, we've got to be better. And I think that's why you already mentioned this, but it feels like going into this offseason that the defense is focused on fixing the back 7 more so than anything else in front of them.
Yeah, and you look at that back 7, you think of what positions are going to be open. Kenny Moore's got his on lockdown. I would think as of right now, Zaire Franklin's contract status should have him where he's at. Although, it's notable that it doesn't, Chris Ballard mentioned, with him, you can't win with distractions. And so there might be some other options in terms of, certainly with skill set too. We talk about what he, his limitations on third down. So there could be maybe some wiggle room to another guy working in there, but those 2 of your starting spots. And then I would think that Nick Cross entering his 4th year after what he just did seems likely to keep that spot, but that could again be a spot where they bring in a higher level of depth that I don't know, that probably can't beat him out, but they had to create a competition for him last year in camp. Who knows? Maybe they look at that here, but at the very least, that's 3 of the 7 spots you see starters. I think those other 4 should all be open. Julian Blackmon's a free agent. They tried that again, but he had to play through a shoulder injury, move positions, didn't hit the upside we saw in camp. I tend to think he's probably going to head somewhere else. I think it's time for that for him and for them. I think he needs to go try it with a team that's since he's signing a lower level deal, 1-year deal, a team that's maybe more ready for the playoffs, and they need to get a little bit more open-minded there. And then those outside corner spots, again, you'll keep Jalen Jones and Juju Brents on the roster, but there's no issue with having like 4 really good corners. I mean, the Eagles had, and they kept adding to them. And, so like that's been part of the issue is once Chris Ballard says in the front office, when they say, hey, we like this guy at this position, they don't want to add to it anymore. Like that's where he said competition has got to be a lot different. So we should see up to 4 new starters. And then EJ Speed's that other one that he's a free agent. And I just think they should try and upgrade at that position, get something that's both more reliable, but also, like we said, better fit for some of these approaches they want to do. So that's where I assume that a lot of the front 4 is going to be the same because it's just kind of locked in. And obviously Chris Ballard likes it. The back end outside of Kenny Moore, for sure. I think Kenny Moore, you could argue, is the only guy that no doubt is not going to lose any playing time and should not have any threat to it. I wouldn't be surprised if they put everyone on at least a little bit of notice, at least in terms of like, this is a good depth player who could work in, and you're not just guaranteed for 100% snaps.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's interesting that someone who like kind of built his reputation in Chicago on finding corners hasn't been able to do it in Indianapolis so far. And like we said, Brent's is partially injury is not partially, it's injury related. We have no idea what he would look like if he was healthy. But he hasn't been able to do it so far. Jalen Jones is currently trending to be maybe the best one he's found.
Yeah.
Depends on your evaluation of Rock Yassine's whole career. That's not great.
Yeah, that's a toss-up between them. That's where it's at. Exactly. There's no upside for sure. There's no like, this guy's a stud.
Yeah,
I mean, all the good outside corners
no franchise corners in there.
No, I mean the good ones he's had are the free agents, and that's where like I thought they would go that route. They didn't see the same guys there, and so it's like you got to pick one. You got to go to the draft for free agency. But in the past, they've gotten Stephon Gilmore and Xavier Rhodes. Had a good year before it fell off. So that's where, that's. And who knows? It should be a mix of that, really. They should sign, like we've talked about this a lot on here. Just you sign somebody and draft somebody when you have like a position that's a big time need. They could very easily do that at outside corner. And if Jalen Jones takes a step, if Juju Brents is all of a sudden healthy and looks like a really good player, then maybe you have 4 corners that you feel good about, and that's not a problem. That's like what needs to be the new mindset.
You'd rather have 4 corners that you feel good about instead of 4 corners on the roster that you're trying to figure out which one is going to hurt you the least if someone gets hurt?
Hey, we don't do this podcast except to bring hot takes. So, yeah, I'm willing to say that. And honestly, that's the thing I've thought about is that we knew there's a lot of risk for Juju to get hurt. It's bad luck for sure that he got hurt in literally the first game. But then they went every game with Jalen Jones and Samuel Womack. Imagine if
one of them had gotten hurt.
Oh my gosh, they cut the guy right behind them in week 5. That was Dallas Flowers, who couldn't, and he didn't have a working Achilles. Like they were really fortunate the way that panned out. Actually, is that just one corner of the 3 being hurt and the others playing every game. I mean, it could have really. That's why we set off those alarm bells in camp. Is that like injuries are what could really rip this up, and they on that front mostly got through it, and then we just saw the talent taper off at the end. But there's no telling that you could have 2 injuries, and that's where if you have 4 guys, you have 2 injuries. That's you still have 2 starters. I believe that's how math works.
They also need a safety. Maybe that'll be next week's podcast.
The safety position.
Maybe next week we'll just go in on the safeties. We did not mean to go in on the corners, but that's just kind of how it happened.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because we started this talking about blitzing, and so you're thinking about like linebackers and safeties, but a lot of that conversation ends up being about corners. And so, like, especially if they hire Wink Martindale, we're going to talk about corner on every podcast because his career has followed when he's got really good corners, it goes one way. When they don't, it goes the other way. So that's just going to be reality for a lot of this.
We'll see what the Colts decide to do. Well, this is Thursday afternoon. They're still in the middle of interviewing. I'm not sure. I think Dennis Allen maybe has not gone yet. My understanding is he was late this week. So he's either today or tomorrow, I think. If there's a coordinator hire, that will be the topic of the next podcast. We don't know if they're waiting on anybody. I don't know if they're waiting on anybody to finish games this weekend or next weekend or 2 weeks after that. We don't know any of that yet, but that's the biggest, most pressing story. We've still got stuff coming. We've still got at IndyStar. For now, though, keep an eye on the defensive coordinator search and in the playoffs. For the IndyStar, I'm Joel Erickson. This has been Nate Atkins.